Okay, well, thank you so much. It's so good to be back with you all in our third movement. And we crossed half of the finish line. We're getting there, getting closer to our liberation. I wanted to reiterate these four themes that we'll be exploring, that we have been exploring, we'll continue to explore. And these four concepts sound simple in theory, but in practice, the hard work of transformation can begin within us and through us and into community. Today, we'll dive into more practical analysis of how we can carry these learnings to our organizations, into our churches, and into our homes. Today, I'll be exploring a few writing prompts. So if you have a journal close by with a pen, please have ready. I want to begin today with 3 grounding breaths to again collectively unify our shared dreams, our shared desires, our hopes, and even perhaps our shared suffering. So together, let's take an inhale through the nose, breathing in fully, and exhaling through the mouth. And hold the stale stagnant air throughout the day. So, second breath in through the nose. Exhaling through the mouth. The final third breath together. Inhaling through the nose, bringing us to this present place in time with each other across all different types of time zones, places, and experiences. And exhaling through the mouth. Sending love and compassion to each other, our fellow classmates. Last week's content may have been difficult to hear, difficult to speak even for me. For some, it may have brought up some forgotten memories of feelings of past trauma, perhaps shame, perhaps there was fear, perhaps there was a sense of suffering. And so to honor, to acknowledge any trauma or suffering that might have come up in last week's lecture, I want us to put our hands in this prayer position with our thumbs gently resting on our sternum. Bringing our hands closer to our heart space, we can be able to feel its warmth, cultivating divine love within us. And just notice how heat is being generated through your hands as your hands are in this prayer posture. And here again for one breath together. With your thumbs resting on your sternum, you might notice some feelings that arose for you in context of a conversation of suffering, violence. Notice if there's any physical sensation in the body that feels painful or tense. Your head, perhaps your eyebrows are furrowed. Into your jaw, perhaps your jaw is being clenched. Moving down into your shoulder space, an area that often needs a lot of tension. Into your heart space that feels pain or suffering or emotion. Into the gut space or digestive tract that also hold tension, anxiety. Moving down to the quads, also an area that gets tense because we're sitting in front of our computers most of the time of the day. Or perhaps our feet are suffering from being on our feet, depending on what the type of work we do. Or maybe we're just tired and we carry that within our feet. So notice a place in your body that feels pain or tension. And as your hands have been warmed together, bring your hands gently to that space of pain, of tension, wherever it may be. And let the warmth of your hand cover that area of pain and tension. And with these next 3 breaths, we'll send love, healing love to that area. Breathing in through the nose. And exhaling love. Second time, breathing in through the nose, cultivating the warmth, divine warmth that we carry within, and exhaling love. And the third breath together, inhaling divine love that we cultivate within us, and exhaling divine love. As we move forward in our lecture today, let us be reminded that our breath is still always present for us, as a reminder of the common breath that we all breathe together in our differences, but also in our similarities. Let the breath be a reminder of the ways that we breathe life into our communities as we also inhale life, receiving from our communities. To recap a little bit further, I wanted to kind of pull out some of the themes a little bit more of what that will carry us into what we explored today. So in witnessing dignity, we talked about the practice of identifying with stories that are not ours. And all of these practices, these 4 practices that I've shared, require that we are actively listening. The community has a voice, and sometimes we're so busy teaching or serving or doing other things that we aren't actively listening. Without listening to their thoughts, feelings, or ideas that differ from our own, we fail to provide relevant support. But when we listen, we gain an insight greater than our own, and through that collective wisdom, we can shape a way forward together. My purpose of bringing these stories from survivors of sexual violence to you is to also provide case studies for your own ministry context with survivors. As we recall, 1 in 3 women are survivors of sexual violence, 1 in 6 men, and almost half of people who identify as queer are survivors of sexual violence. And so that just broadens the scope of who we encounter and how we might be able to help them. And as we hear these stories of suffering, we as pastoral leaders have a mandate to heal that suffering, both at a personal level and also at a society level. The second movement brings us to healing that suffering. And we talked about the harm of cultural silencing that perpetuates sexual violence. We can respond, fall apart, or we can heal, and we can heal, all the things. Responding to suffering sometimes brings up what we call comparative suffering, right? And that's where we compare different types of suffering, saying that my suffering is worse than yours. This is not the trauma Olympics. We are not trying to figure out who's been the most suppressed out of all of us. What triggers that sense of comparison, though, is a sense of fear and scarcity. And if we serve a God who is abundant, limitless, there should be no fear, scarcity. Compassion is not finite. It is generative. And so when we share compassion with others, through the sharing of our stories, we actually experience the sense of reciprocity. So I want to simultaneously ensure that we are holding and honoring our own unique struggles individually, while also holding and honoring the unique struggles that others might have. And in doing so, we will be able to better respond with compassion and experience that sense of reciprocal healing. Our practice as pastoral leaders is to be honest with ourselves, to say that the burden that I carry is heavy and I need help, support. How do we ensure that we do not reflect our own fear and anxiety and trauma onto the other person in front of us? But how do we identify with the story, being present to the suffering without taking it on? Otherwise, that's how we fall apart, experience burnout, or vicarious trauma. We talked about how shame, ego, and control are underlying issues that we must constantly confront as humans, as leaders. And like all things, it is a practice. And so today I'll share those antidotes to these things to help us alleviate the suffering that we cause to ourselves by clinging to shame, ego, and control. Healing happens in reciprocity in community. And today I want to dive into the structural programmatic frameworks that might be helpful for you to consider to carry forward into your own context. So moving into our third phase, transforming love, the journey of transforming in body, mind, and soul. I thought that it was fitting that yesterday was Ash Wednesday, marking the beginning of Lent, the journey of the Passion of Christ, the suffering of Christ, the temptations of Christ, as we talked about in Henry Allen's 3 Lies. I am what I have, I am what I do, and what others say about me, which also relate to the 3 temptations that Christ experienced in this season. And we anticipate, we wait the culmination of the resurrection. And in this practice of transforming love, we are reminded that humanity suffers, yet Christ has overcome the world. So during this season of Lent, we are focusing inward in silence, solitude, and stillness, praying and hoping and waiting for liberation to be upon us, even though it has not come yet. Jesus' first message upon beginning his ministry in Mark and Matthew starts with the word that's been translated to repent, metanoia in the Greek, which literally means change, or even more precisely, change your mind. And how strange it is that we all want to transform, but nobody wants to change. We tend to love and protect what we knew from the past rather than to look forward with positivity and hope in the future that could be when people are open to that sense of change. The scripture that we've been looking at also shows Jesus' first public proclamation recorded in Luke. In this movement, we moved from first, the Lord freeing the oppressed, second, comforting and providing for those who suffer, and thirdly, it says to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. From a survivor's perspective, this could look like a journey through mourning and despair to access the other side of hope. And so from a systems perspective, are we intentionally bestowing the marginalized with more beauty and more joy and more praise? Or are we perpetuating the same grief that the world relentlessly throws at them? We must transform our systems in a way that offers a new paradigm rooted in love. And that is the unique calling that we have as pastoral leaders to bring about that sense of transformation. Transformation is also well depicted in the process of metamorphosis, the changing of caterpillar to fly. The first phase that we talked about, inherent dignity, focused on the egg, where we recognize that all people in their diversity have an inherent sense of dignity. Second, the caterpillar. Now, when we talk about this concept in context of our survivors, when we look at this picture of the caterpillar, typically there's this like kind of gross feeling. And there's a lot of correlation that survivors feel with the caterpillar of being low to the ground, feeling ugly, feeling gross, feeling unable to move quickly and stuck on the floor, perpetually in survival mode. Transformation takes place inside, though, the chrysalis, where the caterpillar almost melts completely in this process so that it can take on a new form. It literally digests itself from the inside out, breaking down into what they're called imaginal cells, which put themselves back together into a completely new shape. Its neurons are incorporated into the new brain, which is much larger and more complex to the butterfly. Metanoia. In the chrysalis, it might feel a little dark, a little scary, as in the womb, as in the tomb after death, as in the dark room, the photography studio, the dark night of the soul. Yet this process is necessary for transformation. But the journey to transformation is not linear. Healing doesn't come as quickly as a damaged cause, nor does transformation come through a pre-written roadmap. It's a journey unique to each person, each organization, with its ups and its downs, its highs and its lows, triumphs and challenges, ebbing and flowing with each iteration moving toward transformation. Whether it be personal transformation or communal transformation, there will be challenges as there will be celebrations. There will be losses and there will be triumphs and there will be grief as there will be joy. Freely in Hope's logo, the organization that I serve in, has been designed to convey that sense of transformation, starting inward, transforming outward, this ripple effect. Grace Lee Boggs says, we must transform ourselves to transform the world. Our logo is designed in 3 parts, symbolizing concentric circles, like as in ripple effect, which is also indicative of the process of transformation. And so we'll discuss this process of transformation in 3 phases, through a systems theory approach, observing core community and culture, and then also a programmatic approach, specific to Freely in Hope's program approach, holistic education, leadership development, and storytelling platforms, all which lead toward that journey of transformation. So beginning with the core, we'll start with the system of our core. We are a whole person, mind, body, and soul. We are our own system made in the image of God. While each of these parts of ourselves are interconnected and intertwined, we can also practice things to nurture each part individually, healing mind, body, and soul. As pastoral leaders, we must care for ourselves well if we are to care for our community well. So a journal question that I have for you to begin with is, how do you care for your full self? Your mind, your body, and your soul. I'll invite you to take a moment just to consider and write down a couple of bullet points. How do you care for yourself in your mind, body, and in your soul? When we practice caring for ourselves, it cultivates a feeling of love. And going back to our scripture, I think it also cultivates these feelings of joy and of beauty and of praise. I think the element of transformation correlates well with our mind, body, and soul triad. It's all overlapping and interweaving, obviously, but separating it out can help us think deeper into these practices that help to cultivate that sense of healing, which leads to transformation. So as we think about caring for our mind, what are we hearing? So we do ourselves. What affirmations from scripture or from others can reinforce healing of the mind? Are we offering words of praise to ourselves and to the beauty of who we are? Or are we condemning ourselves with language that's violent? How are we caring for our mind? And for the body, this doesn't just mean to notice the beauty of our body, although yes, all of our bodies are beautiful. We can think about what makes us feel beautiful in our bodies. Beyond clothing or makeup, jewelry, we can also think about the 5 senses. How can I surround myself with scents or sights or sounds that are beautiful? What colors or musical notes are healing for me that help me feel cared for when I practice these things? For me, the sound of the cello or children laughing just makes me happy. And for the soul, Brene Brown says that joy is the good mood of the soul, an intense feeling or deep spiritual connection, pleasure, and appreciation. What practices help me to cultivate joy in my soul? And you'll know that these practices are working. These practices of self-care are working. We don't need to look for it any longer, but it becomes second nature, where every experience can be full of joy. So that is the core practice of the journey of transformation. Moving into the programmatic practice, programmatic framework of the journey of transformation. At Freely and Hope, we have a holistic education model. I talked about this last week, where I learned very early on that simply paying for school fees for a girl who's been traumatized is insufficient. Girls who are survivors of sexual violence need a holistic support system that enables her to thrive. And so we provide education together with counseling, mentorship, safe housing, healthcare, and legal aid. And this holistic model is held together in our community of belonging, which I feel is probably one of the most essential components of our holistic education model. And I surveyed our staff to ask them what elements help to aid in their transformation, and they said that community highest, which leans on this notion of the South African term Ubuntu, which means I am because we are. We've probably heard this many times before. And when we know that we are part of a greater system, the world doesn't seem as scary or as lonely as it once was, making our transformation process supported. And I want to pull out something in our, even though this is an organizational programmatic framework, I think we can learn from it to notice what are the holistic support systems that we have also as leaders. But I want to pull out counseling. Counseling is one of the critical components of our holistic education model because of the level of trauma that we have experienced in our community. Counseling is also a benefit for all of my staff members. But counseling is also the antidote to shame that we talked about last week. Shame is one of the causes of burnout, right? And through counseling and private confession, we are undoing harmful language and practices by practicing a more compassionate rhetoric towards ourselves. If we do not heal that sense of shame, the shame that we carry is often projected onto others. We shame others than ourselves, which actually doesn't alleviate our shame. In fact, it only reinforces it. So when we have consistent opportunities to confess our shame in private spaces, there's a sense of safety and holding so that we can open up to undo the shame that we feel in our bodies, to undo the shame that we speak in our minds, and healing that, undoing the shame that we project onto others. So there's different types of counseling in private spaces. There's pastoral counseling, there's spiritual direction, there's psychological counseling, there's cognitive behavioral therapy, which helps us to tell our minds those new narratives. The language we use internally can be just as transformative, if not more transformative, than what we speak externally. So that is all very important. But there are also somatic-based therapies, such as EMDR, dance therapy, acupuncture, which are all very helpful and useful, especially for those who've experienced a body-based trauma like survivors of sexual violence. So this is a note for all of us in pastoral leadership or in any form of leadership. We must know our limits as a practitioner. I am not a clinical psychologist. Right? So knowing that limit, I'm supporting someone who has needs that I know I cannot support, ensuring that we are seeking professional guidance to support that whole person is critical. I also think, another note for us leaders, if you are counseling someone or have a type of counseling role for someone else, or even a mentorship role for someone else, you must also be receiving counsel. That also helps to facilitate further growth for you as when I first started my organization, Freely and Hope, we had a mission to prevent sexual violence through education. And some of the girls came into our program who were extremely vulnerable due to poverty and lack of access to safe education. And in the very beginning of this forming stage of the organization, I met Mara, who was 18 years old. And she needed tuition fees to finish her last year of high school. And when we met, she barely said a word, but during the whole interview process, her mother advocated for her on her. I was reluctant, but I accepted her into our scholarship program. At the time, I didn't have a selection criteria or any process at that time, but I was really moved by her mother's advocacy. And so I paid for her final year of high school education, and she became a part of our program. For 3 whole years, this girl did not smile. When she spoke, she whispered. And one day when I visited her, I asked her, what was your highlight this year? Trying to spark some kind of smile. And she said when she first started to attend, we just got the news actually that she started to attend the best private university in Nairobi to pursue a career in journalism. I thought it was really interesting that she wanted to do journalism when she was like so soft-spoken, but this is me learning, listen to the needs of survivors, right? So she told me that her highlight of the year was being in university and meeting all of these other students who were in different degrees, studying different things, and she was able to support her friend who was a film major and act in a student film that depicted a story of a woman who was working in prostitution. She said that was the highlight for me because that was me. And I was so confused. Like, what do you mean that's you? Unbeknownst to me, from 8th grade up until that first year of university, she went to school during the day, but worked in the brothels at night to pay for her niece's school fees and basic necessities at home, such as food and rent and electricity. It all started when she was getting raped at 14 years old. It was set up by her then boyfriend, who was pimping her out for several years until he died of violence. But due to the high demand, it was easy money and the necessary way to support her 2 nieces at home. Mara found another brothel and worked at night when she was 18, and that time that we met, in this picture actually, she was completely strung out on drugs, which is why she didn't talk much. Over the 3 years that I knew her, she was quiet, reserved, barely smiling, never laughing, carrying a heavy burden of responsibility to keep her nieces off the streets. So she bore that burden herself instead. Her turning point was when she finally made it to university. She had an experience with a teacher that changed her perspective of herself. He told her, "You're smart. You belong here. You're going to be a great leader one day." She had never heard these words spoken to her before. In fact, most of the teachers that taught her growing up told her the exact opposite, that she would never be worth anything because of the community that she grew up in. Finally, now, where she is in her dream school, a teacher is noticing her and affirming her. And that's when she decided to leave the brothel, stop using drugs, and she started a business instead to sell clothing to her classmates. And she's an excellent writer, an excellent speaker. And she needed time to allow those words to come out. And so this that I will share next is a visual poem that she wrote to tell what her story of transformation looked like.
The screams in my head grow louder and louder. It's become a part of me. Coming from a place where a woman's job is to please a man. A place where abuse against women is normalized day after day. Where women are no longer allowed to express their pain because it always seems to be their fault anyway. A place where little girls are burdened with the responsibility to take care of the family through prostitution. Where little girls are raped as an initiation for marriage even though they are barely strong enough to carry firewood. Growing up in this place, my story was no different. I was guided by fear. Fear because I suffered the consequence simply for being born a girl. Fear of playing and laughing, learning and loving. Fear of speaking out because of the stigma that accompanies honesty. Fear of walking outside because I didn't know who might rape me next. Fear of standing up for the rights because I didn't know if I could, or rather, I didn't know if I had any. Fear of the poverty that forced me to sell my innocence for nothing. I am not safe even in my own body. Chest compressed with bitterness, heart enlarged with rage, tears welling up with all the things I will never dare to speak. Lost deep in the darkness of scars, I tried to cry but I couldn't. And so I painted a picture of the day when I would see light in the midst of darkness, when my unshed tears will result in healing, when every place will be without oppression and every little girl protected, the day when we would all be free. In this painting, I saw that the dawning of this day would arise with me, resisting against what is and fighting for what could be. I started to reclaim the pieces of my broken body. My heart, blackened by violence, now bleeds colors of love. My lungs breathe in strength and exhale fear. My tears are the life that waters places of death. Here I am, created in the image and likeness of God, for my freedom was paid for at the cross. Suddenly, the screaming inside my head stopped. The light radiating from within became a story of transformation painted on my body. This is what transformation looks like. From victim to survivor, oppression to liberation, hopeless despair to divine healing. The scars were there no more. The darkness was there no more. Tears were there no more. The ones who hurt me over and over again were there no more. I gained power over my own story, power to resist the oppressors and take hold of my liberation. And there, my walk towards freedom began, together with the little girls around me. Their hands are held in mine. In them I see reflections of love, love that is healing the darkness of my heart and the darkness of our world. And that's when I realized how beautiful it is that from oppression to liberation, from healing to hope, we all have a story that is unfolding before us. This is the beauty of our transformation.
Through this process of transformation emerges a hopeful vision of what could be. As Mara said in her poem, the dawning of this day would arise with me. She saw that freedom for herself resulted in freedom for little girls around her. Her transformation would result in communal transformation. And so Mara and I designed programs together that would equip survivors for leadership, allowing them to care for themselves as they also cared for their community, providing them with tools, training, and resources to effectively prevent sexual violence, care for survivors, and bring healing to others by telling their own story. So our community program framework includes leadership development in the next phase. So after holistic education, or concurrently with holistic education, they also receive leadership development programs where they're taught sexual violence prevention, self-defense, strengths-based leadership, human rights, crisis counseling, financial management, meditation, restorative storytelling, public speaking, career development, art therapy, and trauma healing. As leaders, when given great power, great authority with our community, we are capable of transforming, but with that, we are also capable of causing great harm. And we discussed that in context of one of the leadership programs at Community and Hope. So in community, what gets in the way of uplifting the community is often our ego. We talked about this last week as well. Our false selves show up as our ego as a form of protection. In today's era, it's so easy to hide behind the mask of our persona on social media, which is largely an ego-driven platform to front. But the ego is soon to be confronted with the reality of childhood wounds and fears that need healing. We don't need a mask, we need an unmasking. And the antidote to heal our ego is to be in relationship with our community. When we are accountable to a diverse community around us, we are able to show up more authentically in a way that's driven by our intentions rather than our ego. Through mentors, close friends, colleagues, and community members, they can hold us to our intentions so that we are operating in alignment with our values across all relationships, so that our public life is in alignment with our private life. So many times have I said something or done something wrong, or my ego was centered in that moment. And instead of my advocacy being on behalf of survivors, it was for myself. And so knowing the intentions that I have to always advocate on the side of survivors, right? Survivors in my community would call me out, sometimes publicly. And I told my close community this, that if I do anything that is not in alignment with my values, if I do anything in my private life or in my public life that is not in alignment with my intentions or who I want to become, they all have permission to call me out. And it's happened many times. And when you have children, it happens probably on a weekly basis. So a question for you to explore in your journal: who keeps you accountable in your community? Who are you accountable to, and who holds you accountable in leadership? Is it a diverse age or demographic? Are you learning from diverse thought, or are these all people who are just like you? So write down a few names. You can maybe draw a circle and all the people who surround you within that circle. Who holds you accountable? This practice of noticing who holds us accountable, especially in context of leadership, is critical in the prevention of sexual abuse. Because if the people who are holding us accountable are all our buddies, right? They all look like us, they all act like us, they all think like us, they're all friends with us to the point of siding with whatever we say or do, right? Our homeboys. That might create harm within our community spaces because we're not actually listening to the needs of our community, but we're only centering the leader. And we've seen this issue many times with many survivors of sexual abuse cases within churches where the board will silence the survivor's narrative to uphold and protect the church leader, right? So to prevent this, a system of accountability is essential to our leadership. Part of our work as a community is to create also new systems within Freely and Hope. So international organizations, especially from a westernized context, have traditionally been oppressive, condescending, patriarchal, spiritually abusive, religious controlling, right, policing, and all of these are prime conditioning for sexual abuse. I don't know if you've seen the new series that just came out on Netflix called African Queens yet. If you haven't seen it, it's a must-see. This was the original mission trip, using religiosity to exert power and control over other people's bodies, which justifies slavery. So I highly recommend that you watch this because it will help you also learn to undo the harmful systems that we knew and we grew up in and we grew up doing. You know, I've been on my share of mission trips back in my teenage years, right? but to undo those systems to create a new system. So instead of following the ways Westernization and these top-down structures have led us in the past, we have an opportunity to transform these harmful power structures, to instead give power back to the communities we serve. Yet at the same time, when power or authority is given to people who have had to protect themselves all their lives, often fear kicks in, the nervous system shuts down, and we default to fight or flight mode. So here I'm talking about the ups and downs of transformation, right? One of the downs, one of the hard, difficult things about the process of transformation in community building, right? Betrayal. And I talk about an experience in my book, the betrayal that comes with leadership and shifting power dynamics is important. Betrayal happens in context of trusting relationships. It's a direct violation of trust, resulting in anxiety, anger, depression, sadness, humiliation, shame, all symptoms of trauma. There's a body visceral response that is often why sexual violence causes great harm on all physiological levels, because 80% of rape is committed by someone who is known to the survivor, a trusted person, an act of betrayal. Folks coming in from traumatized backgrounds and hierarchical structures often will bring those experiences into the organization. And so having experienced betrayal themselves or having been the bottom of the food chain themselves, they might do whatever it takes to protect themselves, moving into an automatic response. Hurt people. And folks who have experienced nothing but abuse may revert to mimic abusive patterns. With power comes the potential for greed and domination over, as opposed to power and community with each other. Calling out people who've experienced trauma into power. Calling people who've experienced trauma into power is critical for that sense of transformation, but approaching it through a trauma-informed perspective is also essential to know how to support power dynamics with folks who've experienced trauma to, again, transform the system so that there's healing across all spectrums. On a systematic level, Brené Brown has done really helpful research on institutional betrayal, when the institution's mandate to protect its reputation over the dignity of people or individuals or communities. The way back toward reconciliation is only through, she says, accountability, making amends, and action. And not many institutions will follow through with this. The same follows for leadership as well, which is why having these communal systems of accountability is critical to undo our ego as leaders so that we don't fall into the same trap of power and greed. The ebb and flow of a systematic transformation is nonlinear. There is betrayal, there is embezzlement, there is fraud, there is toxicity, there is abuse of power. But in co-creating the new system with the community through the hopeful vision, this can help to carry us forward together. The African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. The beloved community, as Martin Luther King Jr. depicted, is an example of this, a hopeful vision of a community in which everyone is cared for. It's absent of poverty, of hunger, and of hate. The tenets of his beloved community were hopeful vision, shared wealth, peaceful conflict resolution, love and trust, and nonviolent philosophy and methods. I want to add this because in context of talking about survivor care, Ella Baker is someone who was also very active during the civil rights movement, who critiqued Martin Luther King Jr. for his patriarchal theology and hierarchical structure. She instead approached it through a more feminist lens that was community-driven and anti-sexist in its nature. So I want to be a little bit wary of men and patriarchal structures that preach nonviolence, because these could be the same folks that are cheating on their wives, with much younger women, where power dynamics are at play. An example, well, Martin Luther King Jr. was the example of that, but an example of countering that would be when Jesus found the crowd who caught the woman in prostitution, right? He stood between violence and the woman. And I think this is a beautiful example of advocacy, not of turning the other cheek or accepting nonviolence. I linked a video for you to watch about a survivor and I in conversation about a nonviolent approach to sexual violence prevention. Grace Lee Boggs, another wonderful advocate, her tenets of community transformation were learning common issues, self-transforming and structure transforming, responsibility for being part of the solution, and making principled and intentional choices. So just frameworks that I'm drawing from today to show you our framework model at Freely in Hope. So the tenets that we have embodied are community care, where we talked about holistic wellness, survivor-centered healing, self and systems transforming. Second is values-driven, values being trust, stability, compassion, and hope. Third, building trauma-informed policies. So kind of when I talked about the betrayal piece, right? If there's betrayal, if there's something that goes against policy, how do you approach it from a trauma-informed lens so that we're not, as an institution, causing more harm by nature of the policy, but actually responding to the harm caused through a trauma-informed lens? Survivor leadership, also critical. A global vision, similar to Martin Luther King Jr. Our global vision is anti-sexual violence worldwide, liberatory practice, and ethic of love, as quoted by Bell Hooks. And finally, reciprocal learning through narrative feedback processes, that is listening to the community. Inclusive education, which is what Wangari Maathai in Kenya promoted through the Greenpeace movement, showing that education should not just be in the classroom here or in the Zoom room there, but it needs to be on the fields, in the forests, in the villages, bringing education to the community. And so that's inclusive education and appreciative inquiry, which is a model of feedback that super helpful to explore. So I hope, our hope as an organization is that if we can cultivate these tenets within the leaders and scholars and staff members that come through it, Freely in Hope, there will be a ripple effect across the various worlds that they impact through their family systems, in their workplaces, in their schools, and influencing public policy. And all of this must be led and informed from the learning from our communities. And this is how our transformation will transcend across culture. Culture. So as we move into transcending across culture, going back to Mara's story, as Mara developed these leadership skills and she helped co-design these leadership frameworks in our organization, she needed then opportunities to lead and to practice this leadership, right? So we traveled to schools and partnering organizations to talk about anti-trafficking, trauma healing, the importance of education for girls. And she told her story about her own internal transformation as an example for her community. At Freely in Hope, we believe that storytelling is one of our critical components of healing. And so we designed what we call storytelling platforms, which are outreach programs that teach communities on the prevention of sexual violence. And so Mara designed a storytelling platform called the Malkia program, which in Swahili means queen. And it is a life skills training and entrepreneurship training program over a 9-month period for women who are working in prostitution. And our goal is to not come in, make them leave the streets and to do something else with their lives, but to provide them skills concurrently so that as they're in their own discernment process to recognize their unique giftings and callings, they can pursue it at their own time. So Mara designed this program 3 years ago. Today, this program is still in existence with our second cohort now. And we have an 80% retention rate for our first cohort and 100% retention rate for our second cohort, which is pretty phenomenal for this demographic. Another storytelling platform that we have is called Super Girls Revolution. That's based in Zambia. It is a weekly program for girls to learn about their identity, to learn about who they are as women, becoming who they are becoming as women, and their choices and options as women that are growing as they're growing. This community is rampant with child marriage. It's still legal under tribal law in this community. So a lot of girls are getting married off early, having children at a very young age. And so our weekly programs teach them there are alternative ways. We don't have to all get married at 13. In fact, we shouldn't. There's our whole life ahead of us. Careers are options. Education is an option. And so we bring that to this community on a weekly basis. We have another program called Eneza, which means make it known in Swahili. This trains high school students on making sexual violence known so that we can end it. We talk about consent, healthy relationships, prevention, and reporting measures. In this community, we're teaching boys and girls together simultaneously. We run a survey at the first week of class of our workshop. And in the first week, 80% will say that it is a man's right to have sex with women. 80%. After our 10-week program, it goes down to 50%. So 30% difference only within a 10-week program. That's only 10 weeks. We also have a more recurrent program that happens over the span of 2 years, where it's a peer leadership model, and they continue to talk about these topics together. This is how I think we will break the generational cycle. We have another program called Jasiri, which means brave in Swahili. This teaches children about body autonomy, consent, safe touch, and building trusting relationships with adults. The youngest child that I worked with in this program was 2 years old. We have another program that we're launching this year called Linta Toto, which means protect the child, and it trains parents on the same modules that we're teaching to children, as we believe the onus is not on children to protect themselves, but it's on us, caregivers, teachers, parents, to protect children in our communities. And this will be released with our children's book called Pendo's Power, which centers a 6-year-old Kenyan girl. And it launches later on this year. So these are all resources that we're providing to the community preventing sexual violence, led by alumni, scholars, staff members, survivors of sexual violence at Freely and Hope. Through their reach, they are impacting over 3,000 people per year. So what about for you? If you are to change the culture around you and have that more systems approach to culture transformation, what does your hopeful vision of a transformed culture look like? What does it feel like? What does it taste like? And what does it sound like? Is there joy? Is there beauty? And is there praise abundant within your community? I'll give you a moment to consider that. So we can't talk about systems theory, systems transformation without talking about the interconnectedness, right? Or the connectivity that we have with each other in context of community. And if our hope is to form loving, healing, transformative connections within our systems, we must also know how to address the barriers to connection. Brene Brown says, the far enemy of connection is disconnection, but the near enemy of connection is control. Our impulse to control outcomes can drive us to anxiety, stress, and tension. And it causes us to operate out of this fighting stage, which is exhausting. It's unsustainable. And so the antidotes to that need to control is contemplation. So here we are going back into the womb, back into the darkness, back into the chrysalis, the silence, the stillness, the solitude, contemplation. We can undo the impulse to control through contemplative practice because contemplation allows for neuroplasticity so that our brain can heal itself from trauma, negative thought patterns, and emotional pain. When practicing contemplation, we're learning to let go, running to control outcomes by connecting instead to the divine within us. This practice builds inner fortitude, stability, and trust in God and in ourselves. And it literally changes the structure of our brain, metanoia. The practice of contemplation allows us to stay in this transforming experience within the chrysalis as we prepare for emergence. This transformative approach that contemplative practice cultivates not only allows for internal personal change, but appreciates its inevitability, essential to a vision of a more just society. And as pastors and leaders, we must hold this tension of the both and, which is what contemplative practice helps us to do, is just to be with the tension, right? To hold the tension without trying to fix it or to control it. It teaches us to not be afraid of darkness, but to look expectantly toward the light. And with that, there's this juxtaposition of tension that we're holding, where we know that with pain, there's also joy. Where there is brokenness, there's also beauty. Where there is despair, there's always hope. And where there is suffering, there is love. So holding these tensions together so that we might also feel this sense of expansion. The second thing that contemplation helps us to cultivate is this simple yet profound concept of love. Loving ourselves, loving others, loving God. It's an all-encompassing practice of contemplation. Leading from a place of love, we learn to let go of the ego and embrace our whole selves, our inherent dignity, undoing shame to embrace self-love. We must remember that love is liberating, not controlling. In cultivating a more contemplative heart and way of listening, I believe we are developing a consciousness that's more aligned with the Gospels and values of justice, anti-violence, love, and compassion. We can begin to live the Gospel now as we become more and more transformed by the renewing of our minds. Metanoia. Final video that kind of shows this sense of metanoia. I know I'm cutting on time a little bit.
Okay.
All right. Again, to bring in the voices of survivors, another story of transformation.
I am still a woman, and I know for years I have let you define what that looks like for me, but not anymore. Your definitions failed me time and time again. Everything they taught me has been taken by this incident. I followed all the rules, but that was not good enough. They said how I kept my body defined my womanhood. Speaking when I am asked to may be respectable. I will not live my life defined by your eyes. You said when one has been touched, she is not desirable. Making it my problem when the shame isn't mine to carry. No more will I carry burdens meant for the perpetrator.
You're good, babe. Good. I have it on mute.
This is how womanhood is to me. My voice is not a danger to society. It is a threat to your ego and systems meant to oppress me. I will release my tongue from the hold of shame and let it find courage to express wisdom. My body, in spite of the pain inflicted on it, is transforming in so many beautiful ways. I choose to embrace it without hating it. Walking with my head high is not disrespectful. It is my rightful power. You made me look down as a way to let so many things fly over me, like words that broke me, that placed me under your control, my spirit crushed by your violence. I will look you straight in the eye, take this hurt and transform it into strength that will not only change my life, but that of others.
And may this story of transformation be our prayer as well. Amen.
Thank you, amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodness, thank you so much. And thank you for centering the voices of the survivor leaders. And I love that term, survivor leaders. In the time we have left, let's just see if we can get in some comments from myself, as well as perhaps a question or two from the audience. And Dean Abraham is monitoring the chat. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, perhaps we can get to it in a few minutes. So let me begin with just a couple of one response sort of to the videos, which I enjoyed watching. I'm wondering how diverse is the storytelling that occurs in your program. You have storytelling, as a practice. I'm wondering how diverse is that? What's the range of emotions? What are the possibilities for expression? So what I'm getting at is that oftentimes when it comes to African Americans and African people, there's a strong emphasis on pathology, and also a strong emphasis on a kind of superhuman recovery. So we're either demons or angels of some kind. And so I'm just wondering, when you're talking with these audiences, and also in your answer, if you could tell me who are the audiences that these survivor leaders are speaking to. I imagine some are fellow trauma victims and so on, but others are funders, larger, global community, European audiences, American audiences, so on and so forth, either by Zoom or in person. And so I'm very curious as to what is the diversity of their expression. And at the end of chapter 15 in your text, you talk about anger and your own anger and the ability to be in touch with that. And I'm wondering if the survivor leaders get to have a chance to do that as well in their work with storytelling.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. The two videos I showed were definitely in that more poetic spoken word form. As you've said, in African tradition, narrative storytelling is so essential to passing on generational wisdom, right? So that is one method. Other methods that we've seen would be through writing, not through speaking. Other methods would be through art. But I will say what is common is storytelling by way of leadership, by way of facilitation, by way of teaching others prevention models. That, in my experience, has always been the outcome, the result. Getting there is not linear, though. Back to my point of transformation is not linear. And we don't enforce it. We don't say like, oh, it's been 4 years in the program, it's time for you to do these things. It needs to be a desire, consensual desire that they have, and through the holistic care that we provide them with the leaders, their social worker, their counselor, right? Are they ready to be in public spaces to tell a story of trauma? How can they first practice that story, perhaps privately in counseling, maybe a little bit more publicly with our community, just with local staff members, to ready them for a public telling. There are seasons as well that I've noticed, right, where some survivors feel so cooped up and oppressed, have been unable to tell their story to anyone, have been silent for so long, they just can't wait to get to the platform to share their story. And then there's a season of a lot of storytelling. Then there's a season kind of going back then to the chrysalis and saying, actually, I'm not ready to tell the story anymore because more trauma that I have not healed from is coming up. So they go back and like, okay, let's heal from that. Now let's tell a new story. The stories change. The stories change. And I think that's the beauty actually of the art of storytelling, is that the more we tell the story, the more we heal. But then the more we heal, the more we recognize how much more we need healing, the more that provides for more transformation. And there is that sense of ebb and flow. I think advocacy can also look different for every survivor, where some of them, they become lawyers. They're like in the courtroom, advocating for other survivors, advocating for themselves, advocating on social media. There are others who take a more quiet approach in their advocacy through how they raise children in their communities, how they are teaching these lessons to their siblings, right? And in context of the audience, I think, yes, definitely how we frame the story matters to the audience. Primarily, they are speaking in public to schools with small children, high school students. We're going to start with parents moving forward, and for that, we'll definitely get our scholars, our staff members who are parents kind of come into that role. And then the work that we do with women in prostitution is all led by women who have been in prostitution. So that way, the story is shared. In all of those communities, there's always survivors that come up. And that's where the survivor is able to kind of speak to that sense of healing and connect at the level there. I do think anger is an essential part of the storytelling process. It's part of that, nonlinear journey. And everyone processes anger differently and in their own time. I think for me, back to, I'm Enneagram 8, right? I definitely process through anger and advocacy together actually promotes my work and activism forward. My therapist also said that anger also keeps you from being depressed. So it's kind of like one of those gifts. I guess I haven't suffered immense depression. I've had depressive episodes, right? But like immense depression and interestingly, if anger is the thing that kind of keeps me going in activism, that's what has been, I guess, my support system. But again, everyone's different, right? And I think the processing of anger might look vocal, as it does for me, and for the survivors that share their visual poems with us, but it might also look more silent and more in a more quieter realm, and we honor all of those different ways.
Okay. Thank you. Let me take one more, unless there's a burning question on for okay, Gina. Let me actually pivot a bit and try to incorporate a lot into one question so that we can get as much as we can in here. I'm going to talk about culture. You mentioned transcending culture. And I'm wondering just how transcendent this experience is across cultures. So how some of the things we talk about here at BSR, and all scholars tend to do this, is particularity and universality. What's the ratio between those two? And how particular are these experiences? And then how universal, what kind of universalism is being imposed into this context? And so I was thinking of the picture of the young boys in ties and shirts as they're going to school learning what they're learning. It's a very, European construct or Western construct of what education should be. Of course, some of the videos had the survivor leaders moving around their own dress, their own clothes, that feel comfortable with them. But I wonder when they present also, what image are they presenting? I mean, how are they trying to cross cultures and represent themselves into Western audiences? And again, I think you mentioned that there's a diversity of audiences. So that's part one of this. The other, or another way to put that is how broad is that ripple effect? How far does those ripples actually go out into the world? Are they limited to Kenyan context, maybe the West African context, the continent, and so on? The other observation, though, is the idea that so we talked about anger and telling your story, and Nikole, am I getting her name correctly? Nikole, in chapter 14. You mentioned the betrayal you're referring to, I'm taking from chapter 14, is Nikese's accusation of you that, you mismanaged funds and so on and so forth. These were festering lies, as you call them. What I'm wondering, though, is usually in organizations, that's a pretty stark case, right? You clearly were not doing the malfeasance, you're not doing that. But in most cases, a lot of the disagreement is, it's subtle. That word betrayal gets thrown around when people have disagreements over policy, disagreements on how things should be done, disagreements over money, of course, and things like that. But how do you handle the sort of normal day-to-day kinds of uses of these kinds of accusations? There are stark cases, of course, and extreme cases, but then most of the time, I would imagine most of it is just sort of just the ebbs and flows of human interaction, the trials and tribulations. And I will end it there because we may leave just a couple minutes for a student question. We'll see if we can do that.
And the question there was, how do we handle, I guess, those disagreements? They're not stark betrayals.
Yeah, they're not stark betrayals, but they can feel like such, and they can be defending it. So people have real chips on their shoulders about.
Yeah, I mean, betrayal not only being
Yeah.
there's different types of betrayal for sure. And there's some instances that, I did not have permission to share in the book as well. So culture, transcending culture, the particular versus universal. I really like that idea. And that's something that I would love to explore in the future. I've done photography work in Asia, but I've not worked with survivors directly in Asia. And so I'm curious how some of these Afrocentric models resonate or not resonate. Even in Africa, Kenya and Zambia, we're seeing huge differences. The beauty of our system is the way that we operate is through a global leadership team, I guess. So I got 2 people in Kenya, 2 people in Zambia, myself, and another Zambian leader that's in the States. So we're operating from 3 different cultural contexts, 3 different programmatic initiatives, but common goal. And so we make decisions in that more communal process. And so with that, when we're kind of saying, okay, Kenya's been around a little bit longer, so we're like, here's a Kenyan program, we're trying to adopt it in Zambia. Let's try. Okay, it's not quite working this way. Let's modify these things. We workshop it together, test it out, and then we have our more contextualized program in Zambia. I think when it comes to storytelling and the survivor experience, that's hard, right? Because I think there are a lot of commonalities. That's why the bond and the understanding that survivors have with each other is so close, just like we do with any of our own cultural affiliations, right? At the same time, there will be particularities with every individual person as well. So it is, again, the both and. What are some of the universal themes that we've learned at Freely and Hope in African context that can transcend beyond? And this is what we're kind of exploring now as, social media, we're sharing more stories and information on social media. We have more connection with our donors. Our monthly donor circle interacts directly with our scholars in conversation through private conversations with donors only. So that way our donors can actually learn from the scholars directly. Those types of experiences as well have been resonating with donors that are survivors. And so this is where I just feel like our storytelling process is so powerful because it is crossing barriers and borders beyond what we ever thought was possible. Instead of only supporting survivors in our cultural context, we're learning healing can transcend cultural context. The healing that we experience in Kenya or Zambia can also heal me all the way in Berkeley, California, right? And so that's where the sharing of story and the community together is what brings about healing practice. And I think that is transcendent. That ripple effect right now in our communities is through our programmatic reach and in their homes that those people go to, right? So 3,000 people per year across both countries. With the influx of social media, we try to have a stronger social media presence. That's been expanding. And we hope that we can start doing more events post-pandemic. The Bay Area also bringing together survivor leaders from all different contexts to continue these conversations centered in our perspective of Afrocentric survivor leadership. So that's something that I'm curious to learn as we move forward. In the context of betrayal, how do we handle disputes? So global leadership team, I don't make decisions in a silo, and I don't think any leader should. That's where we get abusive patterns. Some cases we'll have to handle in community, right? And we have to be very careful of the power structures as well when we do that, so that it doesn't feel like, oh, Nicole's here, that must mean I'm really in trouble, right? It's like, what can my presence help to do? If my presence is not helpful, what are the other team members? How can their approach be more helpful to that person to try to bring them back to values alignment? I think in building systems, you are building a system for the sake of a common theme and a common value. If that person no longer resonates with that theme or value, then they shouldn't be part of that system. They should go to another system that they resonate with, right? And that changes over time. you know? And so I think values, discerning what the values alignment and the policies that discern the systematic processes that keep the values in line is critical for any system that is forming or reforming, and especially if we're coming from older patriarchal patterns, unlearning what we knew before, testing new things, trial and error.
There's a question from the students who were bewildered and puzzled by the statistic of people that went from 80% thinking that men have
Have a right to have sex.
have a right to have sex with women to 50%. So I think the bewilderment has to do with what can we do to increase that gap? And actually, I didn't quite catch it. Who was that group? Was it women or men?
High school students, boys and
Boys
girls.
and girls.
So these are ages 14 to 18.
Oh.
Okay, so we have to think about generational understanding that has been passed down from our grandparents or our grandmothers, right? So that's why 10 weeks isn't enough.
Yeah.
I think 30% movement is huge for a 10-week curriculum for high school students. And they're learning a lot of other things, not just law, but also toxic patriarchy. They're learning about healthy relationships. That's usually the topic that they like the most, right? It's like, you want to get a girl, you don't rape her, okay? Consent, right?
Yeah.
So topics like that. And so in a 10-week process, we're covering 10 different topics. Dropping that down, I think, is huge progress. To get it down even more time, we need more time and more touch points with them. So what that program looks like post our 10-week model, it's another 2-year program. So for another year, they are meeting in peer-based groups that the student leaders lead. So we have a separate curriculum that guides them through conversation that the student leaders lead. That way, learning in peer context, they're having these types of conversations continually and not just waiting for these external people to come in for a 10-week period and then they're gone, right? So that program is helps with continued learning. And then the 3rd year, they design their own community project that teaches the community about their learnings. That is also where I think a lot of that transformation takes place. I don't have the stats on that, unfortunately, because pandemic shut that down. So we have to kind of like redo the whole cycle again. But with that final phase of students leading their own program that teaches the community about consent and sexual violence prevention, I think that learning can also contribute to the number drop. So I wish I had the numbers, I don't, but that's how the whole program flows.
Okay, great. And there's one very provocative question in chat, but I don't think we have time to touch on it today, maybe next week, which is, again, what is the relationship between the particular and the universal? So, yeah, and to those who are asking or puzzling about that question, it's not about particular cultures versus universal culture. It's about principles. So what is the particularity of the experience of these women speak to the condition of the human being? That's the universal. So it's not about universalizing cultures, but what does this experience have to say to our understanding of human being? So that's the universal. So anyway, that's a huge philosophical topic, which we might touch upon next week.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thanks for saying that.
So what we do.
Yes,
This is our pastime. Len and I have this conversation all the time.
yes, we do.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We are at 7:32.
Okay, well, with that, I just want to say thank you again to Ms. Lim. Will you please join me and thank you, Ms. Lim?
Yeah.
Abundance of learning and wisdom and love. So thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you all next week. And my course, I will see you on Saturday.
And my course, I will see you on Saturday too.
Okay. Be well, everyone. Take care.
See you next week.